Birding in Acadia in Maine is at the top of pretty much every bird photographer's to-do list, or even their bucket list. I know it certainly is the top of mine. In our last episode in New York City, we covered some of the basics for getting started in bird photography, and in this episode, we're going to expand on that even further. And where better to do that than in Acadia, Maine? Acadia is known for the abundance of bird species that it has here, but it isn't just the birds that make this place so special. It's also the incredible landscapes. We've got the amazing Atlantic coastline that brings all of those seabirds, and also the mudflats that bring the shorebirds. We've got a lot to see, so let's get started. One of the best parts about bird photography is how lighting and when the birds come out tends to align so perfectly. And I'm talking about sunrise and sunset. This is going to be some of the best lighting that you're going to experience. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't get out there when the lighting is a little bit more harsh, because you could still get some unique images, but it just so happens that some of the best times of day for light and when birds are out is those morning and evening hours of the day. When it comes to the type of lighting that you want on your bird, you're gonna wanna experiment here. Try key lighting as if you were lighting maybe your own selfie at home. And in those morning hours, because the light is coming through so much of the atmosphere, it is much softer, which also is very pleasing to see as well. And while key and side lighting are some of the best types of lighting to light a bird, you're gonna have to get pretty creative here because you can't physically move the bird, of course, so that means you're going to have to move around them, or at least plan for where the sun is going to be when you're trying to photograph a bird in a particular location. But also consider other forms of lighting the bird, whether it be backlight, which can create really dramatic effects, especially when silhouetting a bird. We've got this really incredible scene right in front of us. Truly a cinematic light on this goose. Not the most exciting bird in the world, but when it poses for you in a way that makes you think, whoa, that's just like a beautiful scene right there. And it was turning its head to the right and it's backlit really beautifully, and it's surrounded by all the foliage around it that really frames the whole entire scene. So I fired a couple photos off, and then I threw it into high-res shot mode as well. You can see how impressively this camera tracks the head and even the eye of this bird. Layers and layers of grass. I'm about 100 yards away, and it's still absolutely crushing it with the autofocus. Settings are going to be one of those things that once you get them down in the first place, you'll be able to quickly manipulate them on the fly when photographing a bird. For example, the more that you want your bird isolated from its background, the more wide open that you want that aperture to be. That's more of a personal preference, and sometimes it's the best you can do if you're shooting in a very low light scenario. And if you have a bird that's flying super fast, then raising your shutter speed will be your best bet, except when trying to include motion blur in your photos, which is probably more of an advanced technique. So for my aperture, I tend to shoot wide open, one, because I'm often shooting at sunrise and sunset, so I need all of that light in the image, and I tend to like to have a bird isolated from its background, unless I'm trying to capture the entire environment to tell more of a story around the bird. Otherwise, it can look more like a bird portrait, which has its place, and I love those bird portraits as well. For shutter speed, your safest bet is to shoot at least double your focal length. So if I'm shooting on a 300mm lens, then I want my shutter speed around 1/600th of a second. However, some of these birds are a little bit slower, and if you have a static bird, then you can definitely shoot at a much slower shutter speed, which I'm going to be doing throughout this entire series. And conversely, if there's a bird that's zipping across the sky, then I definitely will be raising that shutter speed as well to reduce any unwanted motion blur in the final result. And then it all comes down to ISO. You can manipulate your ISO quite a bit. Doesn't mean that you want to raise your ISO to crazy high numbers. You still want to aim for as low as possible. However, I shoot with auto ISO most of the time, and when you're in the field trying to take photos of birds, then you don't have to worry about that ISO setting. All right, we got a family or a couple of barred owls right in front of us right now on this incredible trail. And I'm gonna try and be a little bit more quiet so we don't scare them away at all. This is a perfect scenario where I'm slowing down my shutter speed because they're being relatively still right now. And to shoot at a higher shutter speed, I would have to compensate by raising the ISO. And I don't wanna raise it too high. But they are in the darkness right now in comparison to every other area here. So I am slowing down the shutter speed Now keep in mind, because of that, if they fly off, I might not immediately be able to get that shot where, they're flapping their wings, because I'm using a slower shutter speed to capture this more still shot right now. That's kind of one of those things, those trade-offs when you're slowing down your shutter speed to get that nice low ISO shot. Now, once you get that shot, you can also switch to a higher shutter speed in order to capture it flying off eventually. Just keep that in mind as you're shooting. And for your ISO, I'm shooting with auto ISO, and it is getting somewhat high as the owls move to darker areas, but I don't mind using that higher ISO because these cameras handle it really well, and it's pretty easy to clean up in post-processing at this point. If your camera has Bird AI autofocus, definitely turn that on. I know everybody, gets the camera out of the box and maybe it's set to human autofocus, which is reasonable, but go ahead and change that to Bird autofocus like the OM1 Mark II has. Why is this so important? It helps your camera's autofocus system identify those sort of subjects much quicker. And in bird photography, seconds really count. So if you can specify to your camera exactly what to look for, it's going to make all the difference. It's been very impressive how the OM1 Mark II catches on to birds in the field throughout this entire series. It can track multiple birds all in one scene, but also it's able to track birds through branches and even if a bird turns its head around. So one thing that incredibly stands out about the autofocus on this camera with the Bird Eye autofocus and its AI system is that it could literally detect one through branches, but also when the owl turns its head, it's still tracking the bird so perfectly. And you can see when it turns its head around and then looks back at me, it still just locks onto that eye. It's pretty remarkable and really helpful when photographing birds like this, even in a low light scenario. So on your telephoto lens, there's a little thing called a focus limiter. This is also accessible in the menu of the OM1 Mark II. And basically what this does is limits the focus of your autofocus system to a particular range. And by default, most telephoto lenses are using the full range of their focusing ability, which means that your autofocus system has to look through its entire range from minimum focus all the way to infinity. So to help out the autofocus system and make your autofocus system focus much faster, you can specify exactly where the bird is when it comes to the specific range by using that focus limiter. This is kind of like using Bird AI autofocus and specifying to your camera where the bird is in your scene. Back button autofocus, all the craze when it comes to bird photography, that's because so many bird photographers tend to use it. And what it really comes down to is personal preference. People swear by it because you're able to recompose your image without refocusing your image. However, I tend to use the focus hold buttons that most telephoto lenses come with. So if I want to recompose without refocusing, then I'll just click the focus hold button and I'll recompose. To do back button autofocus, you're basically removing half pressing the shutter from your focus and moving that to the rear button. So my recommendation is to try it and see what works better for you if you want to use focus hold with half pressing the shutter to focus your camera or the back button autofocus. To use a tripod or to go handheld, that's going to come down to the particular scenario that you find yourself in when photographing birds. So I'm, throughout this entire series, going to be switching back and forth between handheld and using a tripod. For this tripod, on these sticks, which are Oben sticks, I also have a Magnus gimbal head. The reason I love gimbal heads is it's a fluid head, so you're able to move with the wildlife so easily. And we actually have a video on how to balance gimbals and some of the perks for using a gimbal head as well, so definitely check that out. But what I love about these is that for bird photography, you're able to be a little bit more intentional about your shots. For example, we were using it when photographing an owl, which was a scenario where we were a little bit more deliberate about each shot. I was just moving the tripod slightly and moving with the owl as it inched down this log. For handheld, I tend to go handheld even more. However, I completely understand if many people don't want to hold up big telephoto lenses for the most part. Thankfully, OM lenses and OM system cameras are very lightweight, so I don't mind it so much. The reason I like to shoot handheld is because I find it much easier to pan with quick moving birds, and I can be a little bit faster about each adjustment. All of that is entirely made possible because of one, my steady hands, but two, without giving myself too much credit, the image stabilization of the OM1 Mark II, which has 8.5 stops of IS, and we really put that to the test while out on the boat. DSLR shooters, I already know you guys are going to yell at me in the comments, but if your camera has silent shooting, many of the mirrorless systems nowadays do, then you're gonna wanna use silent shooting for most cases in bird photography because many birds are in fact skittish, especially when photographing things like loons. Aside from annoying the birds with your shutter, it also can annoy everybody in the area because let's be honest, if you've got multiple photographers around all hitting the shutter at once, that can be quite the nuisance. So highly recommend using silent shooting with the added benefit that you're using that electronic shutter and because of that reducing any mechanical wear on your shutter. All right, I'm gonna talk nice and quiet here for a moment because we're trying to photograph hummingbirds, and I'm also posted up right behind this bush right here and kind of camouflaged by a tree as well, just so it doesn't see us at all. We don't bother it in any way. And I'm also using this bush as some foreground for the photos as well. There's a chipmunk and it's adorable. Scratching itself. Oh, that's so funny. My entire SD card gonna be on this chipmunk. That's funny. All right, now he's gone. Anyways, chipmunks, no, hummingbirds. Hummingbirds, all right. The hummingbirds in front of us, this is the perfect opportunity to use ProCap. I'm using ProCap SH2 so that I can get that high frame rate shutter as well, blackout free. That's the fantastic part about the OM1 Mark II. And also, what the ProCap is essentially a pre-capture way of, if you hit the shutter, if you half press it, it'll start taking photos, and then if you fully press it, it'll actually register those photos and save them so that you're not wasting those frames beforehand. And so this is perfect for hummingbirds because I can place my frame on a particular flower and then half press it to make sure it's in focus, and I can actually register those photos once a hummingbird comes by fully pressing down on the shutter. All right, let's talk about framing, one of the most important parts about photography at large, and especially bird photography. How do you frame your subject? Highly recommend using the framing guides built into the camera, whether it be the golden ratio or the rule of thirds. Both of these are fantastic framing techniques and especially good when you're first getting started. It can be tempting to just place your bird in the center at all times, but it's a little bit more fun and interesting to experiment with placing your subject, the bird that is, on one of the lines, and especially focusing on one of their eyes on one of the intersecting lines of a rule of thirds grid. One of the benefits of framing your birds on one of those lines as well is that you can also see some of the scene in front of them, so also showing where that bird is going helps to tell the entire story. How much headspace should you give the bird in your scene? I like to fill the frame as much as possible because, let's be honest, viewers want to see the bird, so giving too much negative space can be a bit of a negative thing. However, with all of these rules, once you fully understand them and practice them, they can always be broken and you can get even more creative. One thing I'm keeping in mind for framing this blue heron is I'm giving it a lot of space. One, because it's very far out and I can't, fill the frame with this bird, but I actually love the environment around this great blue heron because there's ducks around it, there's a lot of trees, and there's a lot of grass and a lot of fog, and it just looks so beautiful. And so I'm framing this bird on the bottom left third so that its eye is almost intersecting right on that line. And using the rule of thirds in a scenario like this is perfect, especially for great blue herons.
See, Acadia's so much more than lobster rolls and crab cakes. It's a bird.
Bird photography is one of the most rewarding forms of photography. There's nothing quite like being immersed in nature and surrounded by birds, knowing that you're well equipped to now photograph them. And I hope you got something out of this video. Let us know in the comments below what your favorite tip in this video was. We would love to see it, but wait, there's so much more, because in this next episode, we're going to cover some advanced photography tips when it comes to bird photography. So I'll see you then.